Hi, I am Gaby. I am Director of Communities at Seed, and with me today is Jamie Burke. He's CEO and investor at Outlier Ventures, the winner of the Europas Awards for being the hottest blockchain investor in 2019. Hi, Jamie. So good to have you here.
Hey there, how you doing?
At Outlier, you support the new era of digital infrastructure, or the Web 3.0. And you call it the Convergence Stack. Could you tell us a little bit about Outlier's convergence thesis and how the Seed marketplace for conversational AI fits into all of this?
Yeah, sure. So it's great to chat to you finally. I'm a big fan of the content that you've been doing.
Okay, thank you.
And yeah, it's great to be able to talk about the project. We've been involved, to be honest, I'm not even sure. It's definitely more than 2 years. It might be slightly less than 3 years in the Seed project. So we're really excited to see it coming to fruition after all the hard work of the team. And you're absolutely right. We kind of see Seed and what it's trying to do in conversational user interfaces as a key component to the Convergence Stack. Actually, the journey to arrive at what we now call the Convergence Stack started 5 years ago when we founded Outlier, and about 3.5 years ago when we first wrote something called the Convergence thesis. We wrote a paper on it. And at that stage, it wasn't necessarily obvious, or as obvious as it is now, that blockchain and distributed ledger technology needed to be seen in the context of other technologies and how they interacted. And it was our belief that DLT became a powerful toolkit, especially with kind of programmable tokenized assets, smart contracts, to allow other technologies to scale. So that included IoT, but also looking at big data, and then of course machine learning and AI on top. And so the consistent thing for us across all of that was data. Ultimately, how we capture data, how we kind of care for the provenance of data, how we turn it into a commodity that can be traded in marketplaces, and ultimately how it can be used to kind of power machine learning and AI. So when I first met Mark, I think Mark reached out actually online, and then we were lucky enough to have a face-to-face meeting here in London. And he really opened my mind to the revolution that was happening at that level of the internet. And the belief that increasingly the way we would interact with the internet, and therefore the stack beneath it, would be through these kind of conversational interfaces. And so now I'm kind of a big believer that, whenever I do something on my laptop through a browser using a search engine, it almost already feels out of date. Having to do all of this work yourself and type things in and search for things manually. Surely we can just give a command to something and it goes off and carries out that work for us, or kind of brings the results back to us. And I think the power of DLT and tokenization means that we can increasingly have them carry out more economic activity on our behalf as agents, and we can trust that they'll carry that activity out as we want.
Yeah, trust is for us, of course, very important too. Privacy and trust in the control, the user's control over data too. Well, where are we on the timeline of maturity when it comes to companies and infrastructure and application of all of this? So what will it take to be widely adopted?
Yeah, so it's very early. And I think, whenever you speak to people that are just entering this space, because obviously Bitcoin's 10 years old now, they always think they're kind of late to the party somehow. But actually, Bitcoin is itself still in its nascency. And then, of course, the innovation that it's inspired, different configurations of distributed ledger technologies, which may or may not be a blockchain, where we're looking to effectively create systems that can optimize around very particular functions. And so that's why we refer to it as the Convergence Stack, because we believe there are a number of foundational technologies that need to be built, that need to become interoperable, in order that this kind of thing that we call Web3 can come into existence and that is usable and can scale. And so I think if you were to look at the last 10 years and within that the last 5 years, a lot of the kind of infrastructure has been built, huge amounts of money have gone into it. And this is quite typical with any new technology where people can kind of can sense that it has potential but can't quite quantify its effect and its time frame. You end up with this kind of Gartner hype cycle.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that's really exaggerated when one of the innovations that as part of that is the ability to effectively issue your own money. So of course that naturally attracts a lot more attention, both from entrepreneurs and innovators, but of course media. And so I think that's kind of exaggerated the Gartner hype cycle a little bit. But ultimately, you know, we've kind of gone through this peak of the ICO mania that happened, where huge amounts of money, very loose kind of money, was invested in very big infrastructure projects, you know, 3, 4, 5 year projects, and before there'd ever be a mainnet. And I think now what we're seeing is we've gone through that hype cycle. We're now in this trough of disillusionment, where there's less hype, but there's a lot of industry happening. People are building things, and you know, we're already seeing the fruits of that emerge now. It doesn't attract so much media attention because it's less sensational, and because a lot of the innovation's happening within enterprise, and they're a little bit more cautious about how they talk about this stuff. But it is happening, and I think for us, what we're starting to see come through now as we've moved from this phase of building infrastructure, which effectively at a protocol layer is developer tooling, right? So you still need developers to adopt it and do something with it before it would become usable to the average person. And recently we published a post last week talking about the invisible protocol thesis, which was, you know, we're now at this phase where if you go to GitHub, sub 1% of all developer activity is even remotely related to the blockchain space.
Yeah.
So
that article, I couldn't believe that number.
Yeah.
Really, only like 1%. That, you know, I mean, being in the industry and working in the industry for 2 years now, I was astonished that because, well, you know, like, from my perspective, I thought it would be much more because I know how much is being built in the background.
That's right, and if you think about how much capital went into it, you know, I don't know what the exact number would be, but as a proportion of all venture funding, certainly in 2017, you know, it was probably around 10% plus, and but now we're kind of in this phase where these protocols need to be made usable, and we need to abstract away both the technical complexity, but also this kind of economic complexity of these tokenized systems that we've built, in order that people can, as developers, can take these technologies and then build real sustainable businesses, things that might look a little bit more like a SaaS proposition. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because on the one hand, you can make the technology usable with SDKs and tooling, and I think this is one of the powerful parts of what Seed's about, is effectively making, you know, CUI increasingly usable and more accessible to developers. So we need to abstract away the technical complexity and this kind of financial complexity. And I think that's this next phase of blockchain, which we call kind of invisible protocol thesis, making all of this stuff invisible to a developer, but then also to the end user.
Yeah, speaking of the end user, actually, one of the questions from our community was, what exactly is Web 3.0 and how would a consumer experience it? Will it be all invisible and will just like the interface, like how we talk to data, will that change? So how is it for the end user?
I think it's interesting to ask who is the user in terms of people, but actually I think increasingly people will become a shrinking part of the internet population. So actually we need to be thinking about how things will interact, devices, IoT devices, and then also kind of agents or digital representatives. So as I was just saying earlier, these digital beings that carry out activity on our behalf. Could be in a very narrow way, could be in a more generalized way. And so I think increasingly the internet will be driven, and the economic value that's exchanged will be driven by this kind of growing population of things and agents. Of course, often carrying out activity on behalf of people, but where increasing economic agency is kind of handed over to them. So, if you think about the internet as it is already today, there are more devices connected to the internet than people. As you will well know, I think it's about half of web traffic is from bots and half of that is from malicious bots. And that's one thing that I really learned from working with Seed. And so when we think about that internet and especially that final point that half of the web traffic's from bots and half of that is malicious, i.e. is antisocial or is against the interests of the human population, then I think there's a very strong argument for imbuing or embedding, hard coding the internet with rules that can be a disincentive to malicious activity at scale. So there is a cost, albeit fractional, but then equally there is a reward for good behavior. And I think if you look at the web as it's evolved, many of the failings of the web that have kind of been filled as vacuums or evolutionary niches been filled by these platform monopolies. That's come about because there was a lot of naive idealism when designing the web, thinking that actually we didn't need things like identity, we didn't need things like reputation, we didn't need things like property, that these things could somehow be left out of the web. And I think that worked in the academic realm where the internet was born and the web was developed, but it didn't scale to mass society. And so I think Web3 for me is now, how do we correct some of the failings of the web? How do we remove some of these centralized participants that have captured a huge amount of value and are acting against the interests as the kind of human population of the web, what they do with our data? And I think you mentioned it, looking at how we can make the web more privacy respecting and more equitable. So the way that we kind of summarize Web3 is that it is an opportunity to kind of deconstruct these platforms that have emerged, these platform monopolies that have monopolized data and now monopolize AI. And then how can we decentralize the cloud architecture that gives them that scale, that gives them the advantage of scale? But everybody has their own definition of it. But for me, it's thinking about the web with its complete population, and then thinking about how we can kind of redistribute value. And I think the powerful thing about DLT is that it has this decentralizing effect. I think we also need to be careful about how we think about decentralization, so we don't turn it into a dogma. We can be pragmatic and we see it on a spectrum. But ultimately, I think as you begin to adopt these technologies, they have characteristics that naturally mean that the focus is on the end user and their sovereignty and the sovereignty of their data, and away from these kind of centralized platforms. Sadly, I don't think we'll ever entirely remove platforms. I think history's shown us that there's always this cycle of centralization and decentralization that happens in technology, very often driven by regulatory forces. But it's our aspiration that certainly if we look forward 10 years, that the web will look very different to the way it does now. And hopefully value is better distributed than it is now to this kind of handful of FANG organizations.
That's what I hope too. Thank you for taking the time and talking to me. I wish you a great success in Berlin, my old hometown, on the weekend at Diffusion at the DEF CON. I heard you will have 350 plus developers.
Yeah, I think we've got 750 RSVPs, and we think that will translate into about 350 developers and maybe a couple of hundred other people. But yeah, it's going to be a really exciting event. I don't know if this video will go out before or after that event. Before. Okay, great. So then I would definitely invite members of the community to join us. Seed will be represented there with their technology, and I think will play an important part in how we can interface with the stack. And so ultimately the spirit of diffusion is around looking at how we can combine these currently fragmented technologies into a usable stack that can, win over the 99% of developers.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. My colleague Thomas, our Director of Partnerships, will be there, and Nathan, our CEO. And so the developers will have the opportunity to play with Greenhouse, our marketplace that we were talking about, and stitch together, AI components, bot components, and their own services, and build something great.
Yeah,
okay, thank you again. Taking time, and see you soon.
Yeah, bye. Thanks.
Bye.